Hi folks, this is Karim Raouf from our IT Visualizer channel. Today we'll continue our lab, the Star Trek lab. This is the 21st video or the 21 video. We have been discussing in the previous video the following. We will create a second virtual Hyper-V machine. This second virtual Hyper-V machine will be a second domain controller, and we have our primary domain controller, and we will have this second virtual machine to be also a DHCP failover partner. So we have on the first domain controller a DHCP, and this second virtual machine will be a DHCP or a second DHCP failover partner. And we have this virtual machine also will be a second file server, and it will also be using the DFS replication concept, so it can sync the content of the first file server with the second file server that we will create, so the content on both file servers will be identical. And this second virtual machine will have 8 network cards, okay, because it will be a DHCP, and we will use this DHCP to distribute 8 subnets to 8 branches and main office. We have discussed this before. This is because the Star Trek command or the Star Fleet command center will be the main branch and the ships will be the branches. So every branch and the Star Fleet command will take a different subnet than the other one. We have discussed this. I can show you all a little bit of a graph here, so you remember that we have said in this graph, Star Trek diagram. So here we can see that this is the main office, okay, and these are the ships will be branches. So the Starfleet command center will be the main office and the ships will be branches. The Starfleet command center, its computers will get a different subnet, and every ship, its computer in it will get a different subnet. So for example, this will be 192.168.1.0. so for Columbia ship, the computers will be, for example, 192.168.2.0. so this is different subnets, and our second DHCP will distribute these subnets. It will distribute subnets to the main office and for the branches, okay. And we have the VLAN concept. So every branch will take certain IP or IP ranges according to a VLAN. So we will have our switch, we will have the VLAN concept implemented. So so we can differentiate every branch to take different IP addresses. So this we have done in the previous video. And this second virtual machine will have Windows Server 2019 installed on it, and it will take a name, and these 8 network cards will take 8 static IP addresses, and this static IP address will be IP version 4 and IP version 6. Remember that this server will be a DHCP and a domain controller, so it will have 8 network cards, and this domain controller should have a static IP address, so we will give it 8 static IP addresses, version 4 or version 6, and we will assign the different VLANs to every network card, so we can fulfill our goal that every branch will take, its computers will take a certain IP range, okay. So we have done this in the previous video, and then we have installed the Active Directory domain services on this Hyper-V virtual machine and promote it to be a domain controller. And then we have created our custom console. You remember that we make a custom console so we can access the Active Directory users and computers and different consoles on our server from one place or from one console. So the main concept of the custom console is to have one place to access different consoles from one place, okay, from one window, from one console. So the Active Directory users computers have a console, and the group policy have a console, and the DNS have a console. So here we have 3 or 4 consoles with 4 or 5 windows. No, we can put all of them in one console in one window, okay. And then we have installed the software like 7-zip, it's for compressing and decompressing files, and Firefox browser, and we have also installed the classic shell. It's a program that changes the this is the interface of the classic shell. It changes this Windows 10 start menu, it changes it to this menu. Okay, so this is the software of Classic Shell. So we have discussed all of this in the previous video. What we have done, that we have a second virtual machine, we have promoted it to be a domain controller. In this video we will promote this server also to be a second DHCP, and we will also install the file server of this second virtual machine, and we will make DFS replication, or we will make DFS configuration, and after doing it, it will replicate the content of the file server number 1 to file server number 2. So this video we will begin configuring the second DHCP and the second file server and the second DFS. Before going further, I need just to remember or tell you something. If you remember this graph, we have said, if you can do this, we can see here, sorry, I can just get all of this, it's not this one, all of this, we need to go to the other one. So here we have said that this is our first file, virtual machine, and this first virtual machine has 3 server roles installed on it. We have a primary domain controller, and we have DHCP server, and we have first file server and DFS, and we have the second virtual machine. The last video we have also, it will be installed 3 things. We will have additional domain controller and additional DHCP failover pattern and second file server. What we have done in the previous video, we have created this virtual machine and we have make our additional domain controller. In this video we will make these 2, the DHCP failover and the second file server DFS, and you have said that there is replication between the primary domain controller and the second domain controller, or the additional, so the content on the primary domain controller will be exactly the same as the additional domain controller, or the opposite. The additional domain controller, its content will be the same as the primary domain controller, and the DHCP also we will have the same. The DHCP will have replication with our first DHCP, so our failover partner will replicate with our DHCP server, and at the end we will have also a replication between the first file server and the second file server using DFS replication. Okay, this is not the ideal situation, so this is not a best practice. The best practice is different a little bit from our scenario. Why I am doing this? Because my laptop hardware recommendation or hardware requirement or hardware specs, it's not that much high, so I put the 3 roles on one server and the 3 roles on one server. What is the best or the best practice situation? I will show you all a little bit of a graph here. So here the best configuration is to have a primary domain controller on one server. So this is, you should have only primary domain controller, or we have Active Directory only on one server, and you cannot put any other role on this server. So this is a best practice. And then we have another server to be an additional domain controller. So we have also the additional domain controller. We will not install anything on this server except Active Directory, and this server should only be a domain controller, and the same applies for the primary domain controller. And then we have replication between them. This is, as I said before, it is critical, so the contents of the primary domain controller and the second domain controller will be exactly the same. This is the best practice. So we have 2 servers. These 2 servers only have domain controllers installed on them, and then the second is to have your file server and DHCP on a separate server from the domain controller. So if you have another server, you should install file server on it, and if you have additional, you should install also DHCP on a different server, but you can install both of them on one server. So a best practice is to install the file server and DHCP separately from the domain controller. So we have 1 server, 2 server, and we have the 3rd server, and then we can have another or additional server. This we will use it, or additional file server and DHCP failover, so we can make or we have redundant solution. So if the file server is down, we have another second file server working, and we use the DFS replication to have the content on the first file server to be the same as the second file server. And we have DHCP failover, so if the first DHCP is down, we can use the other one. So this is also will have replication Okay, so we have how much servers? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 servers. Okay, and then we have the DFS. Okay, it's a best practice to put the DFS naming space on a server separately than the file server. So the DFS naming space should be on a separate server from the file server and the domain controller. So the DFS should be on a separate server. It should not be on the file server or on the domain controller. Okay, this is in our lab I have put all of them on one server. This is a best practice. So the DFS to be on a separate server, and this DFS, it will be pointing, or it will be pointing to the contents of our file server 1 and file server 2. You remember that I said that DFS it will be pointing to our file server folders, okay, on this one, and if it is down, it can be redirected to the folders on the second file server. We have said that there would be a replication between these two file servers, so the folders on this file server would be replicated exactly to the second file server, so they will have both data identically the same. So the DFS will be pointing to the first file server folders, so if it is down, it can be redirected to point to the folders on the second file server. So this is the DFS. It will be pointing to first file server if it's working. If it's not working, it will be pointing to the second file server. Okay, and we have additional DFS naming space. It will be also pointing to the first file server and the second file server. So here we will have two DFS servers for redundancy, and we will have two file servers for redundancy and two DHCPs for redundancy, and we have two domain controllers. So this is the best solution. The best practice is to put the Active Directory or domain controller only on one server, and the best practice is to put DFS naming server on one server, as we said here, and to put DHCP and file server each on a separate server. So this is the best solution, or best practice is to put domain controllers separately on one server each, and to put the file server separately on one server each, and the DHCP to be also put separately on one server each. If you don't have that much servers, you can put file server and DHCP on the same server, as we have done this here, and the DFS should be on a separate server than the file server and the domain controller, and it will be pointing to the first file server. This, if it is working. If it's not working, it can be redirected to point to the second file server, and both servers have identical data on it, and it will be maintained by Replication. Okay, and we will have another DFS server for redundancy. If the DFS is down, we have another DFS, and it will be pointing for the two file servers. So in this lab we will create, or in this video we will create the second DHCP failover, and we will make a second DFS server, and we will make replication, and we will configure replication between both file servers. So in this video we will make DHCP failover, we will configure DFS replication between these two file servers, and in the upcoming video we'll make another or additional DFS naming server pointing to both file servers. So let's begin this process. Here what we will do, here we will begin working or configuring the DHCP. So here we will go, and this is the second virtual machine. And here we will begin configuring the failover DHCP. But here I need to also say something. Remember what we have said, that in this, or remember when we was making the duck rules on the file server number 1, we have said that there is classifications, or we use the Active Directory attributes, okay, to be imported to the first file server to use it as classification and tagging of files. This is on the first file server. Okay, on the second file server we need to have these classifications also on the second file server. This should be done, it will not be done automatically, so we need to inform the second file server that there is some classifications. Okay, we need you to have it, so we can also tag the files on the second file server with the same classifications or tags we have done on the first file server. This will be done using the Active Directory Administrative Center, so this should be done. So let me show you all how this will be done. We need to import this classifications from the first file server to the second file server, so the two file servers should have the same classification types. Okay, so we can tag both attributes on both file servers. I will show you all how this is done, so let's begin. So here we will access the second virtual machine. It's now the second domain controller. And also guys, I need also to do something here. I need to show you all. So here we have said that we will configure a replication between both file servers. So how we will do this replication? First of all, if you remember the graph from previously, we have a folder on the first file server called DataCube. So this folder will be on, just a minute, will be on the first file server. So we will have this file server contains DataCube, which contains all of the folders of the main office and the branches, or the Starfleet Command Center and the branches. It will be here on the first file server. Okay, what we will do, we will go to the second file server or the second domain controller, which now will be a second file server. We will create a folder or the same copy or the same folder structure on the second file server. So we have here DataCube, it will contain all of the folders. We will copy them and put them on the second file server, and then we configure the application to copy the contents from all of the folders in this file server to all of the folders in the second file server. So we need to copy all of the folders first from the first file server to the second file server, even if they are empty. So we need to have the same structure of folders on both servers, and when we configure the replication, it will begin copying the content of each folder to its copy on the other folder. Okay, on the other file server. So we will do this also in our lab. So let's show you all how this is done. So let's begin. So here you go. You now begin configuring the DHCP. So we will have add role and features. Okay, so here we will add role and features, and then we tell him next, next, next. Okay, and then we need to add the DHCP server. So this is the second DHCP, add feature, and then we will add a file server. We will add the file server resource manager, and we will add the DFS naming space and the DFS replication. So this will be a DHCP, DFS, a second DFS namespace server, and it will contain the DFS replication technology. Okay, so now we have all of them added, or it will be configured. And then next. Okay, so here it goes. Next, next, and then install. And here what we will do here, we will begin, or we need, after finishing the installation of the DHCP, we need to go to the installation of the second DHCP on the second virtual machine. We need to go to the DHCP on our first virtual machine, and from it we will configure the failover or the copying of the configuration from the DHCP number 1 to the DHCP number 2. So I will show you all this process. So here it's still installing it. So now we will configure the second DHCP. We need to authorize it because it will not give IP addresses to the computers unless it is authorized by the domain. Okay, so now we have done this. We need to add the DHCP console, the DFS console, and the file server console to our custom console. So we will open our custom console. So here we will add snap-in. Okay, add snap-in. You will add the DHCP, the DFS, so we will add the DFS management and the DHCP. Okay, and we will add the file server resource manager. Add. And then that's it. And then I will go to the first DHCP on my first domain controller and tell him to configure the failover. This failover will copy the configuration from this DHCP to the second DHCP. So he is telling me that we have two subnets. Here we can just tell him, just a moment here. What does it say? It says that we have in your configuration two IP version 4 subnets. He didn't. What he will do, he will not copy the IP version 6 configuration from my DHCP number 1 to my DHCP number 2. It will only copy the configuration of my DHCP only for IP version 4. So it will copy these two subnets with its configuration from my first DHCP server to my second DHCP server. Here he is telling me that I will copy these two. Okay, so now I tell him next, and then he tells you to tell him the second DHCP name. Okay, so he will be the partner. Okay, so next I will add the server. Tell him add the server, and then I will browse for my server. Okay, and tell him it's *com/lars02. And then check the name, and then OK, and then OK, and then next. And then here we need to stop here to explain the configuration. Here it's telling you that there is a relationship between your first DHCP and your second DHCP, and he's telling you the name of both servers, and then he will tell you the mode. What is the mode, or what is the type of this relation? It is a load balance. What I mean by load balance, that these two DHCPs will have the same configuration and we will use them both to distribute IPs to our computers in our domain. What is the percentage? The first DHCP will configure 50% of the IP addresses in his pool, and the second DHCP will distribute the rest or the remaining 50% of the IP's pool. He will distribute it. For example, if we have, for example, 100 IP addresses, the first DHCP will configure or will distribute 50, and the other one will distribute 50. So this is called load balance. This is the first option. There is another option called standby. It will not, the second DHCP will not distribute IP addresses. It will be standby. If the first is down, he will begin loading or begin distributing IPs. So I put them in load balance, and we need to have to secure the connection between these two DHCPs. There will be a secret password between them. Okay, so this is to secure the connection between both. Okay, so to avoid there is a hacker, or a hacker install another DHCP, so it will not allow him to be his partner or to be a partner for DHCP unless he provides a password. So we'll do this now. We will tell him it is load balance, and then we need to give him a secret password. So here this is it. Next, and then finish. So now we have our failover configured, but it didn't copy the IP version 6, so this is another issue. And another thing, I think it is paused now. Okay, so here now we will do the replication. We are our first file server. We tell him new replication group. Now we will begin replication, but remember, before doing the replication, we need to make sure, before doing it, we need to make sure that we have created, or we have copied this folder structure from the first file server to the second file server. We will have identical folder tree or structure on both servers, because when I configure the replication, I will tell him to copy contents from these folders to their copies or to their replica on the other server. So you need to copy these folders from file server number 1 to file server number 2 before beginning the replication configuration. So I will tell him to copy these folders, copy contents of this folder to their replicas in the other file server. Okay, so now what you will do, tell him we need a multiple replication purpose. I think it is paused. Okay, so now we tell him multiple purpose replication, and then next, and then we need to name this replication. So we will make it, or we'll name it DFS replication, and this is the domain. Okay, and then we need to tell him, but just a moment, next. Okay, and then we need to tell him the members. So here I am telling him, or what I'm doing here, you need in the DFS replication to tell him what are the members, or what are the servers that will replicate between each other. So you need to tell him the name of the first file server and the second file server. These are the replication members, so, or the two servers that will make replication. So I need to tell him the name. So what we will do here, we will tell him the name. Okay, this is the second file server. I need to add also the first file server. Okay, now we will add the first file server. So this is our two partners. Okay, okay, and then next, the topology, it is a mesh topology, so it will make configuration, it will make full bandwidths. Okay, so it will use the network bandwidth. So here the topology mesh, it means that it will replicate with any server in any direction. Okay, and for the bandwidth, so there is a replication between file servers, so this will take from the network bandwidths, and it will be 24/7. So you need to tell him if you need your full bandwidths of your network, or you can limit it. Okay, and you can it will be continuous or in certain days, so you can make replication between the file servers with full bandwidths of your local network and continuously, or you can make it in certain days. Also you can define the bandwidths used, so we will make it continuous and full bandwidths of my local network. Okay, next, and then you need to tell him what is the primary member, who is the primary server, or who is the master that you will copy your content from. So our master will be starcom_01. This is the first file server. It will contain all of my data, and it will be the master, and the last two will be the slave, or it will be the copy or the replica. Okay, so now they will do this, and then next, So here this is it, and here this is the step of telling him where is the folders. So you need to define the folders that will be replicated on your first file server. This will be our data cube folder, but here I am mistaking. I tell him DFS, so do not use the DFS folder. You'll use the data cube folder. Okay, so this is not correct. I will tell him we will use So here what you'll do here, I tell him the path of the folder that I need to replicate, it should be D data cube, okay, not, so here it's not the C, it's on the D, okay. So I need to choose this one, okay. This is on my first file server. My second file server doesn't contain this folder, okay, so it needs to be there. You need to copy this folder as a whole to the second file server. So we will choose this one and not this one. I am mistaken in the video. Okay, so it's not DFS, it is the data cube. And you leave everything as is, existing permissions, so we will leave the permissions on the folder that we have done, and data cube already contains permissions. And then we need to choose the second folder on the second file server. So no, just a moment here, this is also mistaken, just a moment here. So here we have chosen our first folder on our first file server. Okay, this is not correct. This should be, he told us on the first file server this is the folder. Okay, we need to go to the second file server and choose the same folder. So if on our first file server D data cube, we need to go to the second file server and tell him to replicate to D data cube. Okay, I will show you all this was a mistake. So this should be D data cube on the first file server, and the second should be D data cube on the second file server. Okay, so this is not correct. And then okay, here we need to tell him edit. Okay, so here we have chosen the folders to replicate. Okay, and we need to enable this. Okay, so here we will tell him edit. Just a moment guys, I need to get a little bit back here. Okay, so folders to replicate. Select the folder on the primary member that you want to replicate to other members in the replication. So this is the folder we need to replicate, and then we need to tell him the location of this folder. So here we'll choose it. Tell him edit. So it should be, because here I have two folders, so he need the location of these two folders on the second file server. Okay, so this should be, so what I've done here, okay, in the first one, in the first option, folders to replicate, these are the folders that you will replicate on your first file server. And then there is another option to tell him where to replicate these folders on the second file server, and this is what it means by local DFS on the other member. Okay, so this is it. We need to tell him the local path. So here we need to go to the second file server, okay, and tell him, okay, so the first folders to replicate on the first file server, this two options on the second file server. So we need to tell him, go and tell him where to put or where to replicate. We will choose it. We need to choose it. Tell him edit, and then we need to tell him enable. So we tell him enable this option, and then to tell him the path, okay, where to replicate. So we have D data cube on our first file server, so it needs to be replicated to D data cube on the second file server. Enable, okay, and then choose the folder that you need to replicate to on the second file server, okay, and it's not created yet, so I didn't copy it yet, but it should be there. So you need to open D. Here I don't have anything on the second file server, so I will create a new folder. Consider that the data cube is there, or I am creating a folder, name it data cube, okay, and then we will put it here, and then okay, and then the second one, anyway, so he tell you that it's not created there. Next, and then this is the second, so you have two folders on the first file server. You need to tell him the two replica folders on the second file server, so you need to define the location of the replica folders, and you need to define the location of the primary folder, okay. So here we will do another thing. No, here it's not correct. Here I will do the second one anyway. So here you need to tell him, okay, another folder. So here I'll make another folder and call DFS2. So here I have two folders on my file server, DFS1 and 2, but this is not correct. It should be that D data cube, but this shows you how this is done, okay. So now we tell him now create so simply you choose the members, you name the replica and choose the members of the replication, the folders to replicate on the primary and secondary, and then check it or just finish it. Just a moment here. To size the staging folder large enough to prevent replication from slowing or stopping. So this is also another thing. He will have something like a temp folder that he will copy the contents of the file server number 1, okay. He will use as a temporary storage until he copy the contents of file server number 1 to file server number 2. So here the contents will not be copied directly. He will be using a temp folder. He will put the data in it, and then he will copy the data from the temp folder to the other file server. So here we have a staging folder for 4 giga. So the more the staging folder will be, the more or you will not have slowness or stopping of the replication. So we will begin here. Okay, so now we have the replication configured. I need to show you a little bit of a graph here. So here we'll go to the number 20. Just a moment. So here we need to go to the second file server. Remember that I didn't put data cube here, so I need to copy the data cube. I copied the data cube folder. Okay, so I have done this or I did the replication before copying the folder, and we need to share the folder. So we copy the folder to our second file server and we need to share it, okay. I should done this step before doing the replication, okay, but I was mistaken, so take note that I need to go and share also this folder on the second file server with the same NTFS and Smb share permissions. So now we will go there and we'll see the data cube. This is on my first file server, so it is shared already. We will make the share NTFS, the share SMB share permissions and NTFS permissions. So here I'm just staying the permissions. So I'll go to the second file server and then begin sharing it. Okay, and do the same. So we will do the same and put the same permissions. Okay, we will have authenticated users and IT, and we'll do this for the SMB share permissions and the NTFS share permissions. So okay, authenticated users, and then change, and then add Starcom IT, and then apply, and then okay, and then we have it full control. And you need to do this as NTFS permissions also. So this is done. So here I need to show you something, guys. If you need to replicate not the whole folder, you need to replicate only one folder. So what you will do here, you can just give me a moment here. So here, for example, if you need to go there and replicate, you just need to replicate this folder only. So you tell him to replicate and tell him where to replicate. So you need to replicate this global folder to the second file server in the same folder. So I need to replicate this folder only. So I tell him to check the name. So this is the second server, and I need to replicate this folder on the first file server to the second folder on the second file server. So this is to replicate the folder one by one. Right click and replicate. So okay, this is how we can do it. Okay, so this can be passed quickly. I need to go to another thing. I told you we need to make the classifications on the first file server to be copied to the second file server, the replication, the classification of files. So we will open the Active Directory Administrative Center. So all of this we have done the DHCP failover. Here we can see, just a moment here, we can see that this is my second file server and second DHCP. You can see that the configuration was successfully copied from the first DHCP to the second DHCP. And here we will begin. We can see that the replication is already appearing in the second file server. So this DFS replication, it is appearing. So there is a replication, and these two folders I have replicated them from the first file server. So the replication is complete. Here we can see that these are folders that I am replicating from the first file server, and this is the first. This is a couple of files replicated. These are the files on my file server separately, and this is the main folder or the data cube folder. Okay, so anyway, we will now we will need to make a quota. Remember that we have our data cube copied on our second file server. We need to put a quota on this data cube folder. So I will create a quota, okay, and I will create a file screening. Okay, so here I'll create a quota on the second data cube folder on my file server. We have put a quota on my data cube on my first file server. So here we'll do it and then create. And we will make a file screening. So create file screening, and then we will do it here. So data cube, and then okay, we'll block audio and video, and then create. Okay, and then we need to go to the dynamic access control. This is the way, or what we will do now. We are now using the Active Directory Administrative Center to to copy the classification types from my first file server to my second file server. How we will do this? We will access Active Directory Administrative Center from my first file server and go to something called resource property lists, and then we will choose the attributes that we needed to be copied from my first file server to my second file server. So we'll do this now. Right click and then new property list. Okay, we'll tell him the second DFS or the second file server, or file servers, file server DFS, or second file server DFS. Okay, and then start trick, sorry, add. Then we need to tell him the attributes that we needed to be copied from my first file server to my second file server, or the classifications we needed to be imported or to be copied from my first file server to my second file server. Okay, so after doing this, this will be the end of our video. Now we have our file server, second file server configured, our DHCP second DHCP configured. We need to make or to configure our second DFS naming space or second DFS naming server. We have done the DFS replication, but we need to make a second DFS naming server. So we have configured the file server number 2, we have make replication between file server number 2 and number 1, we have make DHCP number 2, and we have replication of configuration from DHCP number 1 to number 2. The second or the upcoming video will begin configuring the second DFS naming space, and we'll begin configuring it to be a backup of our first DFS server. Okay, so now here we'll go to the second DFS. Okay, and then we will add the attributes that we needed to be so here this will be the things that I needed to be copied from my first file server to my second file server. This is the department, location, and title. Okay, so we will do this. Okay, and then we'll restart. Anyway, so hope this video is informative for you all, and would like to thank you all for viewing. Thank you so much.